Steven Seagal's directorial debut was so catastrophically weird that it featured a 40-minute environmental lecture, snow imported to Alaska, and a stuntman getting knocked unconscious so realistically that his character was killed off. From budget overruns that cost Seagal his entire paycheck to Michael Caine's hilariously terrible accent, this ecological action disaster redefined vanity projects. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about On Deadly Ground. Fact 1. Seagal forfeited his entire paycheck. Steven Seagal's directorial debut turned into one of Hollywood's most expensive learning experiences when the action star went so far over budget that he ended up working for free. Warner Brothers had given Seagal a $50 million budget to make On Deadly Ground, but the inexperienced director's lack of understanding about the finer details of filmmaking quickly sent costs spiraling out of control. What Seagal didn't realize was that his contract contained a very specific clause that would come back to haunt him. The studio executives, perhaps anticipating potential problems with giving a first-time director such a massive budget, had included language stating that any unapproved budget overruns would come directly out of Seagal's salary. As production costs mounted during the challenging Alaska shoot, with its remote locations, extreme weather conditions, and complex action sequences, the overages began piling up at an alarming rate. Seagal's inexperience showed as he struggled with scheduling, logistics, and the countless decisions that experienced directors handle routinely. By the time filming wrapped, the budget overruns had reached such astronomical levels that they equaled Seagal's entire paycheck for the film. Warner Brothers promptly invoked the contract clause, leaving the star with nothing to show for his directing efforts except the experience itself. The financial disaster was so severe that Seagal found himself in debt to the studio rather than being paid. To resolve this debt, Warner Brothers essentially forced Seagal into appearing in their upcoming Kurt Russell film Executive Decision in 1996. In what many saw as poetic justice, Seagal's character in that film dies in the first 45 minutes, making it one of the shortest appearances of his career. Former Warner Brothers Vice President Bill Daley later confirmed that Seagal agreed to this role specifically in exchange for the studio forgiving the massive debt he owed from his directorial disaster. Fact 2. Snow had to be imported to Alaska. In one of the most ironic production problems in film history, Steven Seagal's crew found themselves in the bizarre situation of trucking snow into Alaska because there wasn't enough of the white stuff for their winter scenes. This absurd predicament occurred during the filming of On Deadly Ground in May of 1993, when the production team discovered that Mother Nature wasn't cooperating with their shooting schedule in the way they had expected. The film was shot in Valdez, Alaska, a location known for receiving an average of 300 inches of snowfall per year, making it one of the snowiest places in North America. However, when Seagal and his crew arrived to capture the sweeping winter landscapes that were essential to the movie's visual storytelling, they encountered an unexpected problem that left everyone scratching their heads. Despite being in one of the most reliably snowy locations on the continent, there simply wasn't enough snow on the ground to create the dramatic winter scenes that Seagal had envisioned for his environmental action epic. The New York Times reported on this peculiar situation with barely concealed amusement, noting that Warner Brothers had announced there wasn't enough snow in Alaska, which came as quite a surprise to the actual residents of Alaska. At the time of filming, Valdez was buried under almost 4 feet of snow, while Nome had 10 inches, but apparently this wasn't sufficient for the specific shots and locations that Seagal needed for his directorial vision. Rather than adjust the script or find alternative filming solutions, the production team made the expensive and somewhat embarrassing decision to truck in additional snow from surrounding areas to supplement what was already on the ground. This added yet another line item to the film's already ballooning budget, contributing to the financial problems that would eventually cost Seagal his entire paycheck for the project. Fact 3. The original environmental speech was 40 minutes long. Steven Seagal's passion for environmental causes led him to film what may be the longest lecture sequence ever intended for a major action movie, clocking in at nearly 40 minutes of pure ecological messaging. The speech occurs at the end of On Deadly Ground, after Seagal's character Forrest Taft has blown up an oil refinery and killed dozens of people, when he's inexplicably invited to address the Alaska State Legislature about environmental protection and the dangers of corporate pollution. Seagal had originally planned to include all 40 minutes of this environmental monologue in the final cut of the film, essentially turning the climax of his action movie into what resembled a documentary lecture or a very long public service announcement. The speech covered topics ranging from oil company corruption to air pollution, climate change, and the destruction of indigenous lands, reflecting Seagal's genuine personal beliefs about environmental protection that he wanted to share with moviegoers around the world. However, when Warner Brothers held test screenings with preview audiences, the reaction was nothing short of catastrophic. Audience members didn't just sit quietly through the extended lecture. They actively rebelled against it by booing loudly, laughing at inappropriate moments, and making obscene gestures at the screen throughout the entire sequence. The studio executives realized they had a serious problem on their hands when people started walking out of the theater during what was supposed to be the film's triumphant finale. Under intense pressure from Warner Brothers, Seagal reluctantly agreed to trim the speech down to 11 minutes, but even that version proved too long for audiences to tolerate. After additional editing sessions and more studio pressure, the environmental lecture was finally cut down to approximately 7 minutes in the theatrical release. Even at this significantly reduced length, critics still singled out the speech as one of the film's most problematic elements, with Roger Ebert calling it absurd. Fact 4. A stuntman was knocked out so realistically his character died. Danish stuntman Sven-Ole Thorsen experienced one of the most bizarre career moments in film history when Steven Seagal accidentally knocked him unconscious during filming, leading to his character being written out of the movie entirely. Thorsen, who was a frequent collaborator with Arnold Schwarzenegger and an experienced action performer, had been cast as Otto, one of the villainous henchmen working for Michael Caine's oil company executive in On Deadly Ground. The incident began when Thorsen first met Seagal on set, and the director asked him to demonstrate his fighting abilities by kicking him as hard as possible. Thorsen initially hesitated, but when Seagal insisted, he delivered a tentative kick that Seagal easily caught before throwing the stuntman to the ground in a display of his Aikido skills. Not satisfied with this demonstration, Seagal encouraged Thorsen to try again with full force, asking him to give it his absolute best shot without holding back. This time, Thorsen kicked Seagal as fast and hard as he could manage, and to everyone's surprise, the action star went down immediately, hitting the ground with considerable force. A day or two later, when they were filming an actual scene together for the movie, Seagal struck Thorsen in the throat during what was supposed to be a choreographed fight sequence, and the blow was so powerful that it knocked the experienced stuntman completely unconscious for 3 or 4 seconds. When Thorsen regained consciousness, Seagal was so impressed by how realistic the knockout had looked on camera that he made an instant creative decision. Rather than treating it as an accident or reshooting the scene, Seagal declared that Thorsen's character Otto had actually died from the blow, and he immediately ordered all of the stuntman's remaining scenes to be cut from the film. This impulsive decision meant that Thorsen's role was significantly reduced, and his character simply disappears from the movie without explanation. Fact 5. Michael Caine's accent made worst movie accent lists. Michael Caine's attempt to play an American oil executive in On Deadly Ground resulted in one of the most memorably bad accents in cinema history, earning him a place on multiple worst movie accent lists for years to come. The legendary British actor, known for his distinctive Cockney inflection and roles in films like The Italian Job and Alfie, was cast as Michael Jennings, the ruthless Texas oil company CEO who serves as the film's primary villain. Rather than allowing Caine to use his natural British accent, which would have been perfectly acceptable for an international oil executive, Steven Seagal insisted that the character should sound authentically American. This creative decision forced Caine to attempt an accent that was completely outside his comfort zone, and the results were immediately noticeable to anyone familiar with American regional dialects or Caine's previous work. The Daily Telegraph perfectly captured the bizarreness of Caine's vocal performance when they described his accent as sounding like a Texan that had been brought up in the mean streets of London. This colorful description highlighted exactly what made the accent so jarring to audiences, as Caine's natural British pronunciation would frequently break through his attempted American drawl, creating a hybrid accent that belonged to no recognizable region on Earth. Critics and movie fans noticed that Caine's American accent was essentially his natural British accent, mixed with some American pronunciations of certain words, creating an inconsistent and distracting vocal performance that took viewers out of the movie every time he spoke. The accent became so notorious that it appeared on numerous worst movie accent compilation lists over the years, alongside other famous vocal disasters from major Hollywood productions. In his later autobiography, The Elephant to Hollywood, Caine admitted that while he enjoyed working with Steven Seagal and the crew, he was not particularly fond of the filming experience in Alaska, though he diplomatically avoided specifically mentioning his accent troubles in the book. Fact 6. The film had 3 different working titles. Steven Seagal's environmental action movie went through a confusing series of title changes during its development, reflecting the evolving nature of the project and the studio's uncertainty about how to market this unusual blend of action and ecological messaging. The film that eventually became known as On Deadly Ground started its life with a completely different identity that would have given audiences very different expectations about what they were about to watch. The project began under the working title Rainbow Warrior, which directly referenced the famous Greenpeace ship that became a symbol of environmental activism around the world. This original title clearly signaled the movie's environmental themes from the very beginning and aligned with Seagal's personal passion for ecological causes that he wanted to incorporate into his action star persona. The Rainbow Warrior name suggested a more peaceful, activist-oriented approach to the environmental message that Seagal hoped to convey through his directorial debut. However, as the project developed and Seagal refined his vision for the character and story, the title was changed to Spirit Warrior, which better reflected the spiritual and mystical elements that became increasingly important to the plot. This second title emphasized the Native American cultural aspects and the character's spiritual journey, particularly the scenes where Seagal's character undergoes a vision quest and wrestles with a bear as part of his transformation into an environmental protector. Eventually, the studio and Seagal settled on the final title, On Deadly Ground, which moved away from the more obviously spiritual or environmental references in favor of something that sounded more like a traditional action movie. This final title change suggests that Warner Brothers may have been concerned that the earlier titles were too focused on the film's message and not enough on its action credentials, potentially limiting its appeal to Seagal's core audience of action movie fans. Fact 7. Jeremy Irons was originally cast as the villain. The role of corrupt oil executive Michael Jennings went through an impressive roster of distinguished British actors before Michael Caine ultimately landed the part, revealing just how seriously Warner Brothers took the casting of On Deadly Ground's primary antagonist. Jeremy Irons, the acclaimed actor known for his work in films like Reversal of Fortune and Dead Ringers, was actually the first choice for the villainous CEO and had been officially cast in the role during the early stages of production. However, Irons eventually departed the project for reasons that were never publicly disclosed, leaving Steven Seagal and the studio scrambling to find a replacement who could bring the same level of gravitas and menace to the character of Jennings. The filmmakers were clearly aiming high in their search for a villain, as they approached several other legendary British actors who were known for their ability to play sophisticated yet ruthless characters. Anthony Hopkins, fresh off his Oscar-winning performance as Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs, was among the high-profile actors considered for the role, which would have brought an entirely different energy to the film given his reputation for playing intelligent and terrifying villains. Alan Rickman, who had already established himself as one of cinema's most memorable antagonists with his performance as Hans Gruber in Die Hard, was also on the studio's wish list for the part. The fact that the production team was pursuing such prestigious actors demonstrates the ambitions that Seagal and Warner Brothers had for On Deadly Ground, hoping to elevate it above typical action movie fare through sophisticated casting choices. When Michael Caine finally accepted the role, he brought his own considerable reputation and acting credentials to the project, though his performance would ultimately become memorable for very different reasons than anyone had originally anticipated when they began their search for the perfect villain. Fact 8. Billy Bob Thornton appears in one of his earliest roles. Long before Billy Bob Thornton became an Academy Award winner and household name, he made a brief but memorable appearance in On Deadly Ground as a nameless henchman named Homer Carlton, delivering just 4 lines of dialogue in what was one of his very first film roles. This was 1994, well before Thornton would write and star in Sling Blade, the film that would launch him to stardom and earn him an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay just 2 years later. At the time of filming, Thornton was still a relatively unknown actor trying to make his way in Hollywood, and his appearance in On Deadly Ground shows him as a much younger and heavier version of the lean, angular actor audiences would later come to know. He plays one of the mercenaries working for R. Lee Ermey's character Stone, who are hired to hunt down Steven Seagal's character after he becomes a threat to the oil company's operations in Alaska. Despite having only 4 lines in the entire movie, Thornton manages to make an impression with his brief screen time, displaying the natural charisma and slightly unsettling presence that would later make him famous in films like Sling Blade, A Simple Plan, and Monsters Ball. Steven Seagal apparently recognized something special in the young actor even during this early stage of his career, as he gave Thornton those memorable lines rather than making him just another silent background villain. Looking back at this small role, it's fascinating to see the future Oscar winner in such a minor capacity, especially considering how his career would explode just a few years later when he became one of the most respected actor-writers in Hollywood. The casting demonstrates that even in his less successful directorial effort, Seagal had an eye for spotting talent that would eventually prove itself on much bigger stages than the Alaskan wilderness of On Deadly Ground. Fact 9. Seagal had to star in Executive Decision as debt payment. Steven Seagal's financial disaster with On Deadly Ground led to one of the most unusual contractual obligations in Hollywood history, forcing him to appear in the 1996 thriller Executive Decision as a form of debt repayment to Warner Brothers. After the massive budget overruns on his directorial debut left him owing the studio a significant amount of money, Seagal found himself in the awkward position of having to work for free to settle his obligations. Executive Decision starred Kurt Russell as an intelligence analyst who must board a hijacked passenger plane to stop terrorists from detonating a deadly nerve agent over Washington, D.C. Seagal was cast as Lieutenant Colonel Austin Travis, a special operations soldier who leads the initial boarding mission onto the aircraft. However, what made this role particularly unusual was that Seagal's character meets an early and dramatic death, getting sucked out of the plane at 35,000 feet during the dangerous boarding operation. Former Warner Brothers Vice President Bill Daley later confirmed that Seagal's participation in Executive Decision was directly tied to resolving his financial debt from the On Deadly Ground debacle. The studio essentially used his contractual obligations to force him into taking a role that was completely unlike his typical action hero parts, where he usually played invincible characters who survived until the final credits rolled. The irony of the situation was not lost on industry observers, as Seagal's character dies in the first 45 minutes of the film, making it one of the shortest major appearances of his entire career. Many saw this as poetic justice, given that his ego-driven directorial effort had caused such financial problems for the studio. The role effectively served as both punishment and payment, allowing Warner Brothers to recoup some of their losses while giving Seagal a chance to clear his debt and move forward with his career. Fact 10. The bear wrestling scene features Bart the Bear. One of the most bizarre and memorable sequences in On Deadly Ground features Steven Seagal's character wrestling with a massive grizzly bear during a spiritual vision quest, and this surreal scene was made possible by Bart the Bear, one of Hollywood's most famous animal actors. Bart was a 9-foot-tall, 1,500-pound Kodiak bear who had already established himself as a legitimate movie star in his own right, having appeared in several major Hollywood productions before taking on his role in Seagal's environmental action epic. The bear wrestling sequence occurs during the film's strangest section, when Seagal's character Forrest Taft undergoes a mystical transformation after being rescued by Alaskan natives. During this spiritual journey, Taft must prove his worthiness as a protector of the environment by facing various challenges, including a physical confrontation with the massive bear that serves as a test of his courage and commitment to the natural world. Bart the Bear brought considerable experience to this unusual role, having previously starred in the acclaimed 1988 French film The Bear, where he played the lead character alongside minimal human actors. He had also appeared in Legends of the Fall with Brad Pitt and Anthony Hopkins, demonstrating his ability to work safely and effectively with major Hollywood stars in dramatic scenes that required both physical presence and emotional nuance. What made Bart particularly valuable for this production was his extensive training and the professional handling provided by his trainers, who ensured that both the bear and Seagal could perform the wrestling sequence safely. Many critics and viewers noted that Bart delivered what was arguably the best performance in the entire film, displaying more natural charisma and screen presence than many of the human actors surrounding him in the bizarre spiritual sequences that became one of On Deadly Ground's most talked-about elements. Fact 11. Joan Chen is actually Chinese, playing an Inuit. Joan Chen's casting as Masu, the daughter of an Alaskan Inuit tribal chief, represents one of the most questionable casting decisions in On Deadly Ground. Considering that the accomplished actress is actually Chinese, and has no ethnic connection to the indigenous peoples of Alaska. Chen, who was born in Shanghai and became famous for her roles in films like The Last Emperor and the television series Twin Peaks, was cast as Steven Seagal's love interest and the spiritual guide who helps his character understand the environmental destruction threatening her people's homeland. The casting choice becomes even more puzzling when considering that the film's entire environmental message centers around respecting and protecting indigenous cultures and their sacred relationship with the land. Chen plays Masu as the wise and beautiful daughter of Chief Symbolic, who recognizes Seagal's character as the prophesied warrior who will save her people from the corrupt oil companies' destruction of their ancestral territory. This type of casting was unfortunately common in Hollywood during the 1990s, when studios frequently cast actors from one ethnic background to play characters from completely different cultures, often with little regard for authenticity or cultural sensitivity. The practice was particularly problematic in films that claimed to champion the rights of indigenous peoples, as On Deadly Ground purported to do with its environmental and pro-Native American themes. Chen herself is a talented and respected actress who brought professionalism and skill to the role, but her casting highlights the disconnect between the film's stated message about respecting Native American culture and the production's actual commitment to authentic representation. The irony was not lost on many critics and viewers who pointed out that a movie supposedly dedicated to protecting indigenous rights had chosen not to cast an actual indigenous actress in one of its most important Native American roles, instead relying on the problematic assumption that one Asian actress could convincingly portray any non-white character. Fact 12. It was Seagal's only directorial effort. Despite having a career that has spanned over 3 decades and more than 40 films, On Deadly Ground stands as Steven Seagal's one and only credited directorial effort, making it a unique entry in the action star's extensive filmography. The catastrophic failure of his directorial debut effectively ended any future opportunities for Seagal to get behind the camera again, ensuring that this environmental action disaster would remain his sole attempt at calling the shots on a major Hollywood production. The fact that Seagal never directed another film is particularly remarkable considering how passionate he was about the environmental and spiritual themes explored in On Deadly Ground, and how much creative control he fought to maintain during the production process. Many action stars of Seagal's era eventually transitioned into directing as their on-screen careers began to fade, but the complete financial and critical failure of On Deadly Ground closed that door permanently for the Aikido expert-turned-actor. While there have been unconfirmed reports that Seagal may have contributed some uncredited directorial work to a few of his later direct-to-video releases, none of these claims have been officially verified, and he has never received another directing credit from any major studio or production company. The film's poor reception, combined with the massive budget overruns and negative publicity surrounding the production, made it clear to Hollywood executives that giving Seagal directorial responsibilities was not a risk worth taking again. This makes On Deadly Ground something of a historical curiosity in Seagal's career, representing both the peak of his Hollywood influence, when he had enough clout to demand directorial control, and the beginning of his decline as a major action star. The film serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of giving too much creative control to someone whose talents may not extend beyond their established area of expertise. Fact 13. The film won a Razzie for Worst Director. Steven Seagal's directorial debut was so poorly received that it earned him the dubious honor of winning the 1995 Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Director, officially cementing On Deadly Ground's status as one of the year's most critically reviled films. The Razzie Awards, which celebrate the worst achievements in cinema each year, recognized Seagal's inexperienced and heavy-handed approach to filmmaking with this unflattering accolade that highlighted just how badly his transition from action star to director had gone. The Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Director was just one of 6 Razzie nominations that On Deadly Ground received, demonstrating the breadth of the film's failures across multiple categories. The movie was also nominated for Worst Picture, Worst Actor for Seagal's performance, Worst Actress for Joan Chen, and Worst Screenplay, showing that the problems with the film extended far beyond just the directing to encompass nearly every aspect of the production. The Razzie win was particularly stinging because it came from an organization specifically dedicated to highlighting cinematic failures, meaning that Seagal's directing was considered not just bad, but among the very worst of the entire year. The award recognized his inability to handle basic directorial responsibilities, from managing the film's pacing and tone to controlling the budget, and working effectively with his cast and crew during the challenging Alaska shoot. Razzie founder John Wilson even included On Deadly Ground in his book The Official Razzie Movie Guide as one of the 100 most enjoyably bad movies ever made, ensuring that Seagal's directorial disaster would be remembered as a prime example of how not to make a film. The award served as a public acknowledgement of what industry insiders already knew, that giving Seagal complete creative control had been a costly mistake that resulted in one of the most notorious vanity projects in Hollywood history. Fact 14. Louise Fletcher appears uncredited as a bartender. Academy Award winner Louise Fletcher makes a surprising and completely uncredited cameo appearance in On Deadly Ground, playing a bartender in one of the film's more memorable scenes despite her legendary status as one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. Fletcher, who won the Oscar for Best Actress in 1976 for her chilling portrayal of Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, chose to take this small role without receiving any credit in the film's opening or closing titles. The cameo occurs during the infamous bar fight sequence where Steven Seagal's character Forrest Taft gets into a physical altercation with local oil workers who challenge his environmental beliefs and his general presence in their establishment. Fletcher appears as the no-nonsense bartender who witnesses the entire confrontation, including the bizarre moment when Seagal makes a grown man cry by touching his soul with philosophical wisdom about the nature of humanity and environmental responsibility. What makes Fletcher's appearance particularly intriguing is that she was already an established and highly respected actress by this point in her career, having appeared in numerous acclaimed films and television shows since her Oscar-winning performance nearly 20 years earlier. Her decision to take an uncredited role in what was clearly a Steven Seagal vanity project suggests either a personal friendship with someone involved in the production or simply a willingness to take on small parts that interested her, regardless of the project's overall quality. The fact that Fletcher chose not to receive credit for her appearance adds an element of mystery to her participation, as most actors of her caliber would typically want their names associated with any film work, even in small roles. Her presence in the film represents one of the more surreal casting choices in a movie already filled with unusual decisions, bringing serious dramatic credibility to a scene that quickly devolves into typical Seagal-style action and mystical nonsense. Fact 15. The character's name, Forrest, was deliberately symbolic. Steven Seagal's choice to name his environmental warrior protagonist, Forrest Taft, represents one of the most heavy-handed examples of symbolic naming in action movie history, making the film's ecological message even more obvious and on the nose than it already was through its plot and dialogue. The name Forrest serves as a direct and unmistakable reference to forests and the natural world that Seagal's character is fighting to protect from the destructive oil company operations in Alaska. This deliberate naming choice reflects Seagal's approach to the entire film, where subtlety was consistently abandoned in favor of making sure that every audience member understood exactly what message he was trying to convey about environmental protection and corporate greed. The symbolism becomes even more apparent when considering that the character spends much of the movie literally fighting in and around the Alaskan wilderness, making his forest-themed name feel like an extension of the natural environment he's defending. The naming decision also fits with the broader pattern of heavy-handed symbolism throughout On Deadly Ground, where characters, dialogue, and situations are designed to hammer home the environmental themes without any room for ambiguity or nuanced interpretation. Just as the film features eagles soaring majestically over pristine landscapes and Native American spiritual ceremonies, emphasizing the connection between people and nature, the name Forrest ensures that viewers never forget what the protagonist represents. What makes this choice particularly interesting is that it came during the same year that saw the release of Forrest Gump, another film featuring a protagonist named Forrest, who goes on an epic journey of self-discovery through American landscapes. However, while Tom Hanks's character represented innocence and the American dream, Seagal's Forrest Taft embodied a more militant form of environmental activism, willing to use violence and destruction to protect the natural world from those who would exploit it for profit.